Welcome to another episode of the Looking After Nature podcast, where we hope to bring you close to nature and wildlife in Hampshire. My name is Andy Davidson. I'm here once again with my co-host Carly Harrod. Hi Carly.
Hi Andy. So today we're at one of our small woodland sites in a north of the county called Herbert Plantation, and that is a long way from where I live.
Yeah, we're right up in the far north, absolutely. I mean, we're probably a couple of miles from the Berkshire border, right up near Newbury, as you say.
And why have we come here today, Andy?
Well, it's a lovely one, as you say. We've come here to talk to the ranger here about ancient trees.
This site is only about 25 hectares, so it's quite a small woodland, but it's really nice. We're stood right in the middle and I can't hear any cars.
Yeah, I can hear a bit of bird song in the background. Well, not song this time of year, actually. It's probably just birds calling. There's a little bit of breeze in the trees. It's actually quite tranquil here, isn't it?
It is very tranquil.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at some of the special trees in the woodland here with the help of one of the site rangers. Hi Dave.
Hi Andy.
We've been talking to some of the members of staff who've been around donkey's years, but you're quite a new boy, aren't you?
I am the new boy around here. I joined the team in January, but I have been hanging around a few years. I did my work experience with this team in 2018, so just about finished 3 years.
Because I mean that's quite a difficult way for some people to come into the service, you know, and volunteering is a big thing. Working as work experience and volunteering is a good way to get into this sort of job, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I think volunteer experience is really crucial. So I offered a couple of days a week to the team, and they gladly took it, and that really helped me get some of the skills needed for my first job. So
we're here to look at this. Some of these ancient trees, are these ancient trees or these veteran trees? How do we define this?
I think I'd call them veteran trees. It's hard to say. I think whether something's ancient or not is a little bit subjective. They don't necessarily have to be really old to be ancient, but in terms of veteran trees, they're kind of approaching the kind of the latter stage of their life, and they're showing some certain characteristics which you might associate with veteran trees.
And there's a difference to be made between veteran and ancient trees and ancient woodland, isn't there?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So trees can be old, but the woodland itself can be old without the trees being old within it, if you like. So ancient woodland is defined by woodland that's been around since at least 1600 in the UK, and I think it's 1750 in Scotland. But those trees might not be old within the wood. So that wood might be actively managed, and trees might be being felled and regrown, or other things may have happened, but as long as it's been continuous woodland for that period, it's classed as ancient woodland.
But there's some indicators in ancient woodlands that it's ancient, which is helpful, because clearly we haven't got records going back over 400 years in some cases, have we?
Yeah, that's right. So you're kind of reliant to look around and get some clues. One of the clues is what we're seeing in front of us today is some of these old boundaries, ditch and bank boundaries that people used to dig to mark out the outskirts of their land. One of the other things might be the plants you find in the wood. So
yeah.
there are loads of interesting plants, things like primroses or wood sorrel or bluebells, things like that are ancient woodland indicators. And if you find a clump of those together or a section, you might be looking at an ancient woodland. And
they're always a good indicator, because it's gone over most of the plants we're looking at in terms of ancient woodland indicators.
Yeah, that's right.
But I can just about see there's some, is it Enchanter's Nightshade?
Yes, I believe it is, yeah.
And there's a bit of Dog's Mercury over there. The bluebells will have virtually all disappeared by now. They're all underground, just bulbs, aren't they? So there's nothing left of bluebells, tends to be this time of year.
Yeah, and we've got lots of wild garlic over that side as well, which often you find with bluebells.
And when you look at, I mean, as you say, it shows that the wood itself has been here that long, because all these plants take that long to develop. You won't find those in a new woodland, will you?
That's right, yeah, they're slow colonisers. So if they're here, then the woodland has been here for a long time.
And actually looking, because as you say, we've got a big boundary bank. It's called a wood bank, isn't it, quite often?
Yeah.
So it's dividing this bit up. I think we own both sides, don't we?
We do, but historically this was two different parts of land. So what happens is someone will dig a ditch and they will put the spoil up on their side of the land to define it. And then they sometimes plant trees along that bank, or they self-seed along that bank, and it leaves this kind of mark within the woodland that gives you a clue as to the history.
And actually looking across to the far side, which is probably what we're calling secondary woodlands, that's woodland that's grown up on its own, or I don't think it's been planted this bit, it's grown up, it probably would have been a field over there.
Yeah.
The trees themselves that are growing there don't look much different to the ones on this bit, which is probably ancient woodland.
Yeah, So it depends how it was historically managed. There is a building back there called something to do with kiln or kiln yard, so there may have been some stuff grown here for firewood, for firing things or whatever, so it may be that they've come in here and taken a bit more as well. It's hard to know exactly where the boundary sometimes is. But yeah, I'm not sure whether this section we're in here now is ancient woodland. Some of this was part of an old estate, so it was a large field, and there is record at some point of this being ploughed. So it has actually come back more like secondary woodland. Even if perhaps it was ancient woodland originally, it might have been felled and then ploughed for a while.
But what is really obvious are these really spectacular oaks.
Yeah,
We've got on the bank itself.
yeah. This is what we came to see really. These there's a row of 6 or 7 of them, really defined in the wood, quite obvious when you walk past them. And they're displaying loads of great characteristics of trees that have been here a long time and are starting to become veteran.
And actually we can hear at the moment, hear the tapping up there.
Yeah,
That's probably a nuthatch. We've just heard a nuthatch. Hopefully it might have been picked up on the recording, going choop 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 choop. There he is. There's a nuthatch up.
yeah, I can see him.
That branch up there hacking away.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're like little tiny woodpeckers, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah. It's lovely to see a nuthatch.
And you only get those in really established woodland, and they love this sort of tree because,
Absolutely.
I mean, perhaps we better describe this. As I say, it's a large oak we've got in front of us.
Yeah, it's large. It's on the bank, so its kind of roots are gripping around the side of the bank. It's got a kind of initially a tall, quite wide, thick trunk, and then it stretches out as you'd imagine a good shaped oak tree to do, but the lower branches are starting to die back. There's deadwood here, some branches have fallen off, and it's getting some gnarled kind of characteristics in places.
How far around do you think that trunk is?
I reckon it's about 4 metres around.
And that's one way of aging these trees, is by measuring the circumference of what we call breast height,
Yeah.
which is basically the middle of the chest. I mean, I think my chest is a little bit lower than most people's, but
Carly's hugging the tree now to show us. It's about 3 hugs, 2.5 hugs, 3 hugs, something like that.
And but that varies because you can get really, really good ground, which is very good for tree growth,
Yeah,
which can give you a big fat tree
exactly.
in no time. Well, I say no time, in
Tree time. No
tree
time.
time is a couple of centuries,
Yeah.
and yet you could have really poor ground when the same age tree wouldn't be anywhere as big as that. But there are some formulas for working that out, aren't there?
There are. It depends. There's lots of places you can look, and they don't always agree. But yeah, to find the DBH, you've got to take the circumference and divide it by pi, and then you've got the diameter, and then you times it by a growth factor. And each tree species has a different growth factor. With oaks, they say about 1.5 to 2.5 centimetres a year they put on. But obviously, the only way to really tell is to cut it down and count the rings.
Which we don't want to do in this
I think
case.
I get into trouble.
But I think it's safe to say that's probably several centuries old, isn't it?
I think so. I think it's between 200 and 300 years.
Yeah. And it's looking up, you say there's plenty of dead wood in there.
Yep.
The tree down to our left, actually, there's another one there. It's got this big, it looks like a big knuckle halfway up, doesn't it?
That's right, yeah, that's like a very large canker. It's almost like a disorder or a genetic change in the tree, a bit like a wart or something that we might have. But it creates another kind of little ecosystem way up there in the tree.
And it's a big ball of wood that sticks out from the trunk. That looks it could be up to 5-6 foot in diameter, that, couldn't it?
It's really big, that one, isn't it? It's quite interesting. It's definitely an interesting feature of that tree.
That's one thing, actually, when you do have to fell some of these trees, a wood turner would actually be crying out for that.
Oh, yeah.
Because those really patterned bowls that they turn,
Yeah.
quite often it's from those sort of cankers, isn't it?
Yeah, highly prized. That and some of the root systems they like, if they can actually get it on their, on their lathe.
But some of the characteristics of because I say you'll get an old tree, then it becomes a veteran. So there's no age definition, is there?
No.
And then it becomes, as it gets older, into an ancient tree. So how would we try and describe an ancient tree, do you think? What are the characteristics?
Well, I mean, sometimes people refer to ancient trees simply by their age. They say, for example, with oak and yew, very long-lived species. Oaks are said to grow for 300, rest for 300 and die for 300.
Yeah.
That's one of the phrases. So if you're looking at something that's sort of above 600 years old, you might say, well, that's an ancient oak. But that doesn't necessarily hold true for other species. So you could have much younger trees that you'd still class as ancient within their own time span. So the things you'd be looking at in an ancient tree is it kind of sitting down, as they call it, and retrenching its boughs. So it kind of pulls in its branches to protect from the wind. It puts a lot of that weight on back around the trunk, around the girth.
Quite often it's more about character than age, actually, because I've got a bit of a list in some things like a low fat and squat shape.
Yep.
Leave it at that. The crown is retrenched, which means it actually withdraws in. You get dead bits sticking out beyond the leaves, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Wide trunk compared with others of the same species. Hollowing of the trunk.
Yeah, I think that's important. Trees begin, as the deadwood inside begins to hollow out, the actual, it's still living around the outside in the sapwood and the cambium layer, but the heartwood of the tree begins to decay. Some of the fungus starts to attack that, and that ends up as a sort of fantastic habitat for those creatures who like deadwood.
And that's it, and that's not always apparent from the outside. It is, as you say, the bark, and just underneath the bark is the proper living part of the tree.
That's right.
So although that tree's got a lot of mass and in there, and it's probably more than several cubic meters of wood in there,
Yeah.
the heartwood is dead.
Yes, it is. Yeah, that's where the tree sort of stores its dead cells, and that's really what gives it its structure.
Yeah.
It's like a dead column of those very dense cells that basically give wood its strength.
And actually, some of the, I mean, do you remember the '87 storm?
You know, I was young.
You were young, yeah. I wasn't quite so young, but that big, what some people call the hurricane coming through the southeast of England. Quite often it was the older hollow trees which survived, which stood up, because actually a hollow cylinder is stronger than a solid rod.
Interesting, yeah.
Because it could flex more. So there's part, you know, hollowing out the middle is great for wildlife. Clearly, you get owls and bats and all sorts of insects living in there.
Yeah.
But also it helps the tree stand up, survive longer.
Yeah.
Because it's got that structural strength.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And actually we did notice something interesting on the base of this tree, didn't we?
Yeah, let's go and have a look. So this is a bright red fungus coming out of very near the base on kind of one of the roots. And fungus has an interesting relationship with trees. It can be sort of good and bad.
Yeah.
But the trees use fungus and fungi use the tree. And we think that one's probably an early beefsteak fungus, which is quite common on oaks. But that fungus feeds on the deadwood of the tree. So because it's very old around the outside, that part of the tree is probably just thick enough to support that fungus. It's actually dead in there anyway, so it's not doing the tree any harm.
And that fungus actually is because quite often in the heartwood of oak, and really valuable oak, it's darker wood, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
It's
right.
that brown, because the more living outside bit is quite pale. It's a more darker wood inside the tree. A lot of that colour quite often is from being infected with that fungus.
Right.
So it actually makes the tree, in terms of timber, more valuable.
Interesting.
And it's called beefsteak fungus because actually when it's more mature, I mean it looks like a funny little lump of red putty's been stuck on there, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's quite beautiful. But
it is, yeah.
But it comes up and it's like a big plate of, as you might expect, like a bracket fungus.
That's right, it looks like a steak.
And actually when you cut it open, it looks like raw steak.
Yeah, and you can eat it.
You can eat it. It's not supposed to be as good as eating.
No.
And there's another species which is sometimes getting, it's called chicken of the woods.
That's right, yeah.
And that's bright yellow, quite often a bit further up. But that supposedly is very good eating.
Yeah, people often collect that.
Yeah. So to say it's characteristics, not size, which dictates whether it's something ancient and veteran, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I think so. And you start to sort of look at trees differently and appreciate what's happening in it and start to judge what those characteristics are. You just get a sense of what a normal, you know, quote unquote, oak looks like, and then what one that is starting to get a little bit older looks like. And you can see these kind of the sections that are kind of getting larger around the edge. Sometimes the tree puts on a bit of a life ring, like a growth belt around it, as it kind of sits down to help support itself in its later years.
And of course, you have some trees that are smaller overall as species, a bit like a thing like one of my favourites, field maple. But it doesn't stop them becoming veteran.
No,
you know, they're a lot smaller, but they'll have the hollow in the middle. They'll have shorter and squatter than others of their type. So you can find veteran trees in all different types of trees, can't you?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we say oak might live for 900, or that's quite rare. Field maple might live, you know, for just 200 or 300, and so it veteranises a lot quicker, and that's helpful to all those species that rely on that. So you need that mix of species within the wood. And some trees, you know, like silver birch, are very fast growing, and so they often veterinise very early, maybe within 50 years or so.
Yeah, yeah. And actually looking at some of the things living on, so we've got the fungus there.
Yeah.
There's actually, I mean, we're looking a couple of foot up on the side of the tree, and there's actually a rowan. mountain ash just
Yeah.
growing on the side of the tree.
Exactly. I think that this is I've seen this before, where the kind of depth of the bark is thick enough to support a little bit of soil, and the tree just starts growing, and new species grow on the side of the other tree.
And that's
Some kind of a fern.
yeah, I'm very good at identifying ferns.
We'll
It's a
call it a
beautiful
fern.
fern, isn't it? Just a fern.
Just a fern.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've seen that, you get that up on the, I can't see it on this tree, but on previous other veterans I've seen, you get it all along the branches, several metres up, 10 metres up maybe. And so it's that interesting habitat that happens at height,
Yeah.
which is also something you don't get anywhere else.
And this lovely crinkly bark is a good home for a lot of mosses. There's a whole, it's like a fur pelt here, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Loads of little things that will be living in here, and beetles like to make their home here. You can see little bits of crumbly kind of something what looks like earth, but is sometimes insects burrowing into the bark there and pulling out little bits of wood.
And there could be several hundred species of insect living in this one tree.
Yeah, that's right. Oaks can sort of support up to about 400 species, I think. And as they get older, that only gets better.
And we've been talking in previous podcasts about moths. I absolutely love moths.
Okay.
And there could be, 50 species of moth on this one tree.
Oh, really? Well, I didn't know that.
So we were talking a little bit earlier about the little butterfly called a purple hair streak.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And they don't get seen too often at ground level because they live up in the tops of trees.
Yeah.
And at the right times of year, if you look up with a pair of binoculars, it's absolutely smothered with them. And so there are a lot of butterflies and moths, particularly moths, who live on the oak leaves. And because they're a good hunting ground for blue tits.
Oh, right, okay.
Now, blue tits only do one brood a year, but they can have up to 22 eggs in one nest.
Oh, wow.
That's a bit of a record. I've seen a dozen, 14, but they need to time their emergence of their young to when the leaves are out and the caterpillars start feeding on the leaves.
Right.
It's very time critical.
Yeah.
They didn't do very well this year
Okay.
because May was quite frosty, wasn't it?
Yeah, very frosty.
And the leaves coming out was quite late.
Yes, it was. All the oaks were quite late.
Which would have meant the caterpillars were quite late.
Mm-hmm.
And trouble is the birds time their nest making more to the light period. So they would have think, well, I'll start building the nest in April time. I'll start laying my eggs in May. And then when the chicks hatch out, all those caterpillars will be up there.
Right.
But I think it was a bit mistimed, and there's quite a lot of failures with blue tits in particular this year.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the weather can change a lot, and the tree has to adapt to that as well. Different climates. Some years are very dry and some are very wet, and you can see that in evidence of the growth rings inside a tree once it's felled. You get wide growth rings for those fast-growing years, and then in periods of drought they're all tightly close together. But oaks and many trees are adapted to survive those types of conditions. Perhaps more than some of the shorter-lived species like the blue tit can manage.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully they should reschedule. I mean, it should be back a bit more to normal next year.
Yeah.
And the birds are built to survive this sort of variability.
Yeah.
And that's why they produce so many young. In fact, they can produce 16 or more young from one nest. If they have a successful year, they have a very successful year.
Right.
And, they get past all the sparrowhawks and all the rest, and then those young will breed next year.
Yeah.
So they can cope with occasional years where it's a bit not too good for them. It's like everything fluctuates.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Oaks have a way of managing the species around them by producing masked years of acorns. I think last year we had a huge year of acorns, and they flood the environment with food for squirrels and traditionally pigs. And then they breed more, and they produce more young the next year, and then the oak doesn't produce anything the next year. And so it starves that population. It has a way of kind of self-limiting some of the predators it would have had for its acorns.
Yeah, you don't think of predators for oak trees, do you?
No.
But actually, some of those predators, I mean, we talk about, there's a green woodpecker calling there.
Yeah, that's right.
We talk about predators for oaks, but one of the most important species for oak trees is the jay.
Yes, it's said, I read something the other day, which is hard to believe, but 40% of oaks are planted by jays.
Yeah.
So they're a massive part of the oak's life cycle.
And they can, in one season, plant thousands of acorns.
Absolutely, yeah. And obviously with them and the squirrels, oaks, that's why oaks are probably one of our most common and most well-loved trees.
When I say they're planting, they're not trying to plant oak trees. It's a side benefit. What they're doing is they're caching which is storing food through the winter.
Yeah.
So they'll hide them in the ground,
That's right.
and then they'll, amazingly, they can remember where quite a lot of these are.
Yeah.
But sometimes you'll get one or two, which, you know, the jay dies, so it doesn't go and pick those up again, or it just misses a few. And if you're talking about thousands of, in 1 year, thousands of acorns coming off one tree.
Yeah.
You know, this tree here, we're saying it's 500 years old.
Yeah, 300, I think, probably, yeah.
How many, I'm not going to do the maths, but it could be millions of acorns they produce
Yeah.
over their own lifetime.
That's right. Each oak tree like this can produce 10, 50,000 acorns, something like that, each year. So yeah, it's definitely in the millions.
So the only need really to replace that one tree when it eventually falls over is one of those to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to the jays.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, isn't it? Because people talk about candidate veteran trees which could become a veteran. Every little sapling could be a veteran tree in the future.
I think so. Yeah, that's a really good point to remember. That you know, if we allow them and if we're able to manage it like that, then we can really restore some of the veterans that we've lost over the years.
Yeah. So we've moved a little bit further down here. We've got another two. They're not as big as the last one we looked at, but they are certainly substantial oak trees.
Yeah. Difficult to know. Well, you'd think that they were all part of the same age, but they've probably come and gone. You can see one next to us there that's fallen over.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And there is actually, what's that one in the middle?
Well, initially I thought it was a birch, but not.
It's more like beech bark, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But that's dying,
Yes.
isn't it? That is proper dead wood.
It's dead and it's resting on the tree. And so for now we wouldn't do anything with that because it's at the minute not in danger of falling on the path. And that dead wood at height is what's really valuable. So you get different species of insects living up at different heights. Someone once described it as a block of flats when you've got dead wood like that.
Yeah. And when you've got, because we're on about that fallen one there, because that's clearly lying on the ground.
Yeah.
It's going to be damper. The part of the wood's going to be damper. And beetles in particular love that sort of tree.
Yeah.
The dry wood up there in the sun is good for other species of beetle, but then you'll get species of wasp and bee coming nesting in there as well.
Right.
They don't like the bees and wasps don't like the damp stuff. They like the dry, sunny stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a fantastic habitat to have, and we try and keep that wherever we can. This is under threat from health and safety, basically. We fell a lot of dead wood like that are close to paths. So one thing we can do with veteran trees is get a bit creative with their management. Perhaps there's a veteran tree that we think is really valuable, where we could maybe just reroute the path a little bit rather than fell the tree, you know.
Because there is a lot of dead wood, and that's part of the value of these trees is the amount of dead wood within it.
That's right.
Because clearly it's good for the insects to nest, you know, to breed in and feed on, but then the things like the nuthatches and the woodpeckers come along and eat them, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And deadwood is a really important part of all woodland. In the past it's been kind of cleared away sometimes. People thought it was messy, so they cleared it up and tidied it up, and now I think it's gone back to understanding that it plays a valuable role as part of the ecosystem.
And even though, I mean, we're standing on a path here, actually the chances of a lump of that falling off while we're standing here is pretty low.
Yeah, it is.
It's a very low used path. If this was in the middle of a major country park with loads of people with a bench underneath it,
That's right.
you'd probably have to think about, well, maybe move the bench.
Yeah.
But if somebody's sitting there for a couple of hours,
Exactly,
they're more
yeah.
likely to get hit, aren't they?
That's right, yeah. And I'm responsible for tree safety in our team at the minute, so you have to make those kind of judgment calls. But yeah, absolutely, you're looking at the use of the path, and if it's a bridle way or anything more major, then we have to take some of them down. But there's normally enough that are left within the woodland that no one's going near, so the deadwood habitat is still retained.
So what other management, do you do any other management to support the trees themselves?
I think mostly for veteran trees you let them be, because they're working on a different time scale. But what we have done here, it depends what situation you come across. There's been some clearance around the trees. Sometimes that's called haloing.
Yeah.
You kind of fell a ring of younger trees that are starting to get in the way. Because some of the fast growing birches, we've said, there's a birch right there that's probably only 40 years old or less. So maybe even 20.
Yeah.
So that's starting to interfere with the oak. So you might think at some point of felling that. But veteran trees are a bit like, as we all get older, you want to do things a little bit at a slower pace. So you don't want to do everything all at once.
Yeah.
You might want to do something 1 year and then leave it a little bit, see how the tree responds, and then do something in another 2 or 3 years after that.
And let's think some of these trees, if you had a camera up above on a drone looking down, you'd be able to see the pattern a bit more. But that veteran tree there, it's almost taking up a space as wide as it is tall, isn't it?
Yeah, it's huge. It's got a massive width, hasn't it? So they do need that space, and oaks don't love it when other trees start touching the tips of their branches. So they like space to stretch out, especially at that age. So
And there are some species, I think like beech in particular, the leaves they drop contain toxins which suppress growth around it. So
Right.
it stops other things growing around it.
yeah,
So you've got all these young whippersnapper trees trying to grow up, and it will actually suppress them, won't it?
yeah, you can see that when you go into a beech wood. It's much more. There's hardly any understory there, is
Yeah.
there? As you walk in, a lot of leaves, but no other small trees. Whereas here we've got lots more bramble, and holly in particular grows well here. So I think some of these you can see are very young holly, so they've been felled or cut before, and there's a couple of big hollies that we took out or have been taken out next to that large oak, just to give it a little bit more space.
And again, the thing with beech is the leaves themselves, when you look up, I can see little gaps of light through the leaves here. You don't often see that in beech woods because they effectively, all the leaves work together to block light out entirely.
That's
almost.
right, yeah. They say it's a 98% coverage or something.
Yeah. And then you have something like ash, which lets even more light through than this, and that's quite important for things underneath, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. You want light to be getting through to the ground. So we talked about those ancient woodland plants, and there are lots of other plants that benefit from those pools of light hitting the floor.
And sometimes it's only when a tree like that falls over you realise the big gap in the canopy it fills.
Absolutely, and that's part of the natural process of the woodland. These old trees eventually fall over, and they create a big space that other trees come to colonise.
And I've seen it at Crab Wood near Winchester, where you've got big beech trees like this, and the entire beech is split open and opened up that huge gap in the canopy, and then suddenly everything underneath it is going, oh, light,
Yeah.
and they go whoopee and shoot upwards, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of and there's often young beech next to an old beech like that are just waiting for that moment, and
Yeah.
then they take advantage and shoot up.
And quite often you can tell a difference between a tree that's grown up in a forest as opposed to one that's in a field.
That's right, and I think that's what we're seeing here. When you talked about how wide that is, that gives an indication of why perhaps there was more space here in the past, and how this might be secondary woodland.
Yeah.
Trees that grow in forest are, bunched up together, and so they shoot up towards the light and end up very narrow and have a narrow crown. Whereas ones
with a bushy top.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
And you see these ones in a farmer's field or in a big open space that are the kind of classic view of a tree we might think of, or an oak, where it's wide and tall as well.
Yeah, low spreading branches. I mean, these ones are coming out almost horizontally sideways on this. That original tree we looked at. It is quite a lovely tree, isn't it?
It's beautiful, yeah. I think it's a really nice example.
So even though this is clearly in a woodland now,
Yeah.
that's a fair indication that it was more open around here when it first started growing.
Absolutely. When you often with sort of woodland, they sometimes call it woodland archaeology, when you're looking for clues and signs. And if you've got this bank, you've got this row of trees, you've got a big tree that's open, everything's pointing to this was different in the past, and you have to try and work out what was here before, and do we want to restore that, or are we happy with how things are going now?
Yeah, it's always decisions about this sort of thing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, there is quite a bit of holly here, isn't there?
Yeah.
You see.
Yeah, there is. So some's been felled, but yeah, holly is pretty fast growing, and but those holly trees can be ancient trees as well. So you want to try and keep a good mix of things without letting it take over.
And they're actually quite an indicator of an ancient wood bank, because they will grow. I mean, just looking, there's not much holly behind us.
No.
It is pretty much concentrated round the bank. And believe it or not, although it's quite well known that holly is quite spiny mainly, it's a great forage plant. If you get into the New Forest, there's lots of those semi-wild ponies and cattle down there. Sometimes if they hear a chainsaw going in the winter, they'll come running, because if somebody's chopping down a holly, they can get to those growing tips again and they'll eat it. And it was kept as a forage plant on some of the wood banks,
Right.
for animals to graze on in the winter, because they could just chop it down and they'd eat the leaves, and
Yeah.
so it can be an indicator of the age of the bank again.
Oh, right, that's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. And that sort of brings us to talking about the pollarding of trees that people used to do as management. If you cut down a tree, if it's one of our native broadleaf species, it often regrows and produces more timber for you. And if you cut that down at ground level, it's called coppicing.
Yeah.
And if you cut that down above head height, it's called pollarding. And so you see this kind of history again playing out. You might see old trees that have very big wide trunks but very small stems coming off, and that's an example that's been coppiced or pollarded. And they used to do that to protect against deer and other animals foraging for food on the young buds that would come out from the coppice stalls. So on an old bank like this, they'd sometimes pollarded to stop deers restricting the growth of the oak again.
Because the reason you coppice stuff is to get growth of the same age. So you can coppice a stall down. It doesn't work with pine because it stops it growing entirely. But most, as you say, the normal native, what we call deciduous trees, the ones that lose their leaves in the winter, they will regrow from the stump again. Yeah. And then you can leave it on a coppice cycle for 7 up to 21 years, depending on how big you want those stems to come out again.
That's right.
So if you're after what they call spars, or basically quite often they get staples for holding thatch down. That's quite thin stems they need.
Yeah.
So that might be a 7-8 year cycle, and they should all be the same age. So you'll go along in 8 years, cut them all down, use them for your thatching, and just let it grow again.
Exactly, yeah. And if you do that in rotation in different places in the wood each year, you've got a constant wood supply, and that's pretty much how our woods were managed over the last number of centuries. So you can now, some of that has now made way for other manufacturing processes. So all this is kind of left, and you've got coppice stalls that are starting to become very old.
And pollarding basically is shifting that coppice stall up the tree, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Out of the reach of grazing animals.
Exactly.
And it was thought, there were some suggestions of why it's at a certain height. I've heard some people say it's at the height you can swing an axe above your head and still chop them off without going up the tree.
Right.
I'm not sure if I believe that, but
I don't know if I want to.
Yeah. But I mean, it's a classic with the willow sometimes, where you get next to a river, you get a stump with little tiny branches coming out the top, and that's
right.
pollarded.
Yeah.
It's a bit difficult sometimes because that one there looks like it could have been pollarded.
Yeah,
but
is
some
difficult.
of those stems at the top are probably 80, 90 years old.
Yeah.
So it's not clearly pollarded, but
no, it isn't clear. I wondered about that one at the end, but I'm not sure it is.
that one looks more like natural growth, that one, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of this is natural. Sometimes it's more obvious to see, especially like I say with those willows that are very fast growing and they make very long, thin branches, so it's easy to see. And we've got hazel in front of us as well, so we could talk about that. But.
Yeah, Travis, people see hazel and think coppice.
Right. So you want to...
But they self-coppice because they get to a certain size. Clearly they can cope with lower light levels than most tree species because they don't get that tall. And eventually they will just fall over on their own.
Yeah.
But quite often at a coppice stall, it'll be several feet across, not just out of one little tiny base. There's a hint of a couple of coppice stalls over there, but I don't think it's long established coppice cycle here.
No.
Yeah, that's quite a beauty, that one. That has been, don't know whether it's been coppiced or whether it's just been cut down at some point and it's been grown up.
Or maybe one thing fell at some point, and yeah.
So we've got loads of intertwining trunks out of so the base, actually, if you look at the base, that is bigger than the big tree we started off with.
Yeah, it is.
But a lot of these stems, if you separate them out, look like a reasonable size tree on its own right, don't they?
Yeah, they're probably 100 years on their own.
Yeah. But they're twisted. You can see where they're fused back into each other over there.
Yeah, it's an incredible tree, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like a maze, a puzzle.
And it's full of hollows and full of holes.
Yeah, it's really hard to describe. Wish you could see it on the podcast, but you can see right through sections of it. It's like trees that have rooted with like 2 feet, gripping each other and intertwining. So it's quite remarkable what happens when you coppice trees.
And it looks like, because this is an odd bit, you've got a hole at the base here and this polished bit of bark. And I do wonder whether some animal over the centuries have been going over this bit and just wearing it, badger belly maybe.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to go to another bit of the wood to find a nice lime tree, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go and look at that one, shall we? So we've come up to another tree you brought us up to. This is what tree is this one?
This is a lime, a large leaf lime.
Do we know why it's a large leaf lime?
Yeah, it's got big leaves.
Trouble is, these hybridise, and I can't remember what the difference is.
I think it's got a downy leaf underneath.
It's the colour in the little joints of the veins underneath the leaf, whether it's a white tuft of hairs or whether it's an orange tuft of hairs.
Oh, right.
So you get the small leaf line, which is a really indicator of ancient woodland. And some of the best woodlands in Hampshire, you know, down the coast and that, are small leaf lines in there. You get the large leaf line, and then you get the hybrid between the two. And I can't remember what colour the tufts are under the leaf, so I couldn't tell you right now, but it certainly is an impressive tree though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. This, as we were talking about coppicing, this is an example of a tree that's been coppiced. And as a result, the main trunk, if you like, which they call the stall, is really big. And then you get all these smaller offshoots coming up it.
And it's far bigger than that oak at the base, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, that's got to be probably 5 or 6 metres around.
And actually it's got, because you say it's a bit difficult, it's not two trees growing together, it does look like one tree.
Yeah, I'm not sure about this offshoot, I don't know what that
but
is.
It looks like it's connected. It might be a branch has fallen and then regrown and then formed that one there. And the ground, because there's not a lot growing under here, because there's not a lot of light coming through this one in particular, is there?
No.
But you've got these roots
Exposed.
look like snakes worming their way through, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, they're as big as my leg,
Yeah,
going off in all directions. And that's the thing, the roots underneath the tree go out as far, generally, as the canopy goes out above.
that's right, yeah. People often confuse that when they're looking at trees in their own, you know, streets and driveways. They can concrete all the way around up to the trunk.
Yeah,
But actually the roots go way out up to the what they call the drip line of the tree,
yeah.
and they need just as much soil and light and air as the rest of the tree.
And there's ferns and bracken and bramble around outside the canopy, but there's almost a cut-off line where the canopy sits.
Yeah.
Everything starts growing again.
Yeah, and these branches are almost touching the ground all the way around.
It's a beauty, isn't it?
And it must be 20 metres across the canopy.
Must at least, yeah.
Yeah,
But if we look at the tree itself, it looks like a bundle of about, how many, 8?
yeah,
Each look could be a tree on its own, but I think, as you say, that tree was cut down at the base, probably looking at some of the size of the bits that have grown up, probably 80, 90, 100 years ago.
I think so.
And then all these stems have come growing out of that one, forming this beautiful big dome of leaves, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a question of what someone does in the future. Do you cut it again and let it grow again, or is this was that the final cut?
Well, this is it, because part of the problem is these big ones on the outside in particular eventually, under their own weight, topple out and rip a bit out.
That's
but
right.
then that's part of the natural processes, isn't it?
It is, yeah. If they rip out, then they can cause you know, an open wound that fungi can get in, and that can be the end of the tree. If you cut them, you can control that. So it's often the case that people ask sometimes why we cut down trees. Sometimes it's a case that we're just coppicing, and it actually extends the life of the tree.
But I mean, some of these old trees and veteran trees, there's all sorts of practice there. You go to some trees where they've got props to hold the branches up, and even if there's a hole, they've filled it full of concrete or capped it off with lead. You know, and I do wonder in the future, somebody comes along and says, what did they, you know, you'll do what you think's best. And so, what was he thinking?
Yeah.
You know, this is barbarous, you know,
Yeah.
so it is big decisions to be made here, isn't it?
I think because we've lost a lot of that woodland management skill, and our lives are lived at a different pace than these trees. So, you know, things that are 100 years ago seem like a long time to some people, to most of us. But perhaps the last thing that happened to this tree was 100 years ago, and something else needs to happen soon.
Or you take the view, as in some of the rewilding principle, what they sometimes call self-willed nature.
Mm-hmm.
You just let it do what it wants to do,
Yeah, that's right.
and be comfortable with that.
Yeah,
So there's
exactly.
one of the many decisions you have to make as a land manager, isn't it?
Yeah, are you going to actively manage or sort of passively manage? It's a beautiful tree though, anyway.
Absolutely stunning. Well, thanks for showing around, Dave. It's been a really interesting visit, and it's lovely to see some of these absolutely spectacular trees. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me along.
So there really are some great trees here. This lime that we're stood under at the moment it's like being in a church, like being in a cathedral.
It is. It's absolutely spectacular, isn't it? You know, you've got these massive columns coming up here and the branches dipping down vertically to the ground all around. You feel really protected in here, don't you?
Yeah, it's like a magic little circle.
And you can go and find your own ancient trees and veteran trees as well. Because I talked about, you know, the characteristics of an ancient tree, but that structure and the size and the fact it's reduced in height and dead wood. So you can go online and search for the Ancient Tree Forum. They'll tell you about ancient trees around the country. And actually, if you want to go and search for yourself, you can find one if you think it's ancient or veteran, and then put it on their databases. So that's a really good way of finding some of the history of the land.
And we've got some quite cool ancient trees actually in Hampshire.
Yeah, there's some really spectacular ones, aren't there?
Now, one of the trees that is one of the longest growing ones, and we quite often see as an ancient tree, is yew.
Yeah, and I've seen some really good ones. Quite often they're in churchyards, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because alongside ancient and veteran trees, you get a thing called champion trees as well. Do you know much about them?
So champion trees are generally the biggest or best specimen of that tree. So it's not necessarily the oldest or the rarest, but it's a good specimen of that tree. And we have a lot of champion trees at Hilliers, Arboretum.
Because they planted all sorts of non-natives as well, alongside some of the natives. And they got some of the finest specimens there, haven't they?
Yeah, and that's what a champion tree is, a good tree specimen. So one of the oldest trees in Hampshire is the Farringdon yew, and that is nearly 3,000 years old. But it's not quite as old as the Fortingale yew, is it?
No, that's up in Scotland, and I've actually been to that one. And that's supposed to be 4,000 years old, I think. And it's amazing what's gone on in that lifespan. You know, the Romans have come and gone. You know, the Saxons have invaded. So it's quite unbelievable almost that somebody's lived that long.
I do wish that trees could tell stories, because I think they'd have some fantastic stories to tell about all the people that have passed by them or sat underneath them for some shade or had their lunch sitting underneath them. So, are you ready for another one of Carly's fun facts, Andy?
Have I got a choice, Carly?
No. So, although trees look passive and helpless because they can't move, they can't run away from things, they are actually a lot savvier than they seem. So some trees produce chemicals to combat leaf-eating insects, and some also send airborne chemical signals to each other, warning nearby trees to prepare for an insect attack.
Yep, so you can get, this tree here might well have a caterpillar hatch out on it and start eating, and then the leaf will react going, oh, I'm being attacked, and release the chemical. And then that can tell the rest of the leaves on the tree that you need to start producing some nasty stuff.
Yeah.
Because we're going to get eaten. And as you say, it can trigger other trees to do the same as well, which is quite amazing, isn't it?
They've done quite a lot of research, and they focused on apple trees coming under attack by caterpillars, and they release chemicals that actually attract caterpillar-eating birds to those trees.
Fantastic, isn't it?
They are fantastic. They're not just a lump of wood.
And looking at this lime tree, as I say, there's not a lot growing in it, which I think is partly because all the light's cut out by the leaves up above. But you do sometimes find that the leaves fall, they give out toxic chemicals which suppress the growth of anything underneath it.
Beech do that a lot, don't they?
Oh yeah, beech are notorious. Beech woods are generally pretty bland underneath, not a lot of undergrowth. And it's just, they're dominating that woodland.
Yeah. Survival of the fittest. I hope you've all enjoyed this episode of Looking After Nature. We'd love to hear from you with any comments or thoughts, or if there's anything you'd like us to discuss in a future episode. Let us know by checking out our social media pages.
And we'd really appreciate it if you rate and review our podcast on iTunes, as this helps other people find us. For now, thanks again for listening. I'm Andy Davidson.
And I'm Carly Howard. See you next time.